When you take photos outside during the day, you want the most efficiency from the flash. And there's what you might call a sweet spot at maximum flash sync speed. Now it's usually 2/50th of a second, but sometimes 1/60th, depending on your camera. This is because higher shutter speeds imply a wider aperture, and this wider aperture allows your flash to reach further or work less hard for the same exposure. By the way, one thing I haven't mentioned before is that with some camera and radio trigger combinations, even though you have the shutter speed set to the max sync speed, there may still be a slight dark band at the bottom of the image. I'm not going to go into any great detail on this, but very briefly, because at maximum flash sync speed, you're on the very edge of your camera's capabilities, slight synchronization errors can creep in. So if your max sync speed is say 2/50th of a second, you might have to shoot at 200th, especially inside where the slightly dark band may be more noticeable. Anyway, back to the subject of this video. Being limited to the max sync speed causes problems when shooting on bright sunny days. Let's say 200th of a second, you may need an aperture of f11 just for a correct exposure. And then if you want to darken the ambient light and also soften the flashlight with say an umbrella or softbox, well then you're going to be struggling to get enough light from your flash. Also, even if you had enough light, you obviously don't always want to be shooting at such small apertures. Sometimes you might want to blur the background using a wider aperture such as f4 or even wider. There are several ways around this problem. The first is to shoot at the time of day when the ambient light levels are lower, or if it's sunny, just maybe move into a shaded area. But you know, sometimes you might want to take photographs in the bright sunshine, and there are two solutions to this, neither of which is ideal, but with care they do work. The first is high speed sync, often referred to as HSS. Now I've included a video from one of my other courses which goes into quite a lot of detail about max sync speeds and high speed sync, so please watch that for more information. But very briefly, high-end DSLRs from Canon and Nikon have this special HSS flash mode, but this mode can only be used with higher-end flash guns dedicated to that particular manufacturer. The manufacturer themselves make these speed lights, but they're also available at lower prices from third parties. In this HSS mode, you can use shutter speeds that exceed your maximum sync speed. So if your maximum sync speed is say 160th of a second, you can use 2/50th, 500th, 1000th, 2000s and even higher. Instead of the flash firing a very short burst of near instantaneous light, it fires a pulse of light for the whole duration that the shutter is open. So in effect, the flash becomes a continuous light source. It's a brilliant technology, but because shutter speed controls the continuous light, the higher the shutter speed, the more light you lose from the flash. Think of ambient light. If you change your shutter speed, you change your exposure, and that's exactly what happens with flash in the HSS mode. So with that in mind, if you want correct flash exposures with high speed sync flash, then you either need to move your flash in much closer to your subject or use multiple flashes. But even 3 speed lights will only buy you 1.5 stops of light. So just be aware that your flash could end up as just being merely a fill light. By the way, as well as requiring capable camera and flashes, you may also need triggers and receivers capable of high speed sync. But the price of radio triggers and receivers has recently come tumbling down, so it's a good option. And instead of having to shoot at say 2/50th at f11, using high speed sync, you can shoot at 2000ths at f4. But as I said, you'll need to get the flash in close or use more than one flash for some extra power. So to summarise, high speed sync is a good option for allowing you to use wider apertures for selective focusing, but it doesn't buy you a great deal in terms of overpowering bright sunlight. There's another, in some ways better option for getting wider apertures during daylight hours, and that's using a neutral density filter, usually referred to as ND filters. These are darkened pieces of glass that are placed over the lens and which cut down on the amount of light. Because the filter covers the lens, both the ambient light and the flashlight entering the camera is reduced. So it doesn't really buy you anything in terms of getting extra light from your flash, to overpower the sun. It simply allows you to use wider apertures. It has other uses for other types of photography, but for off-camera flash, wider apertures is what we're interested in. So for example, if the required settings were 2/50th ISO 100 aperture f11, you could put a 3-stop ND filter over the lens, and then the equivalent exposure would be 2/50th ISO 100 aperture f4. The downside of ND filters is that first off, you're putting more glass over your expensive lens, and depending on how good the filter is, it could reduce image quality or cause a slight colour shift. Also, because the ambient light is reduced, you might have problems focusing. The good thing about ND filters is that you can still use your cheaper manual flashes and triggers, plus you don't need a high-end camera. To illustrate the point better, I've set up a little experiment. You're probably sick of the sight of her by now, but first of all I'm going to shoot her without any flash, just against the brick wall, and the settings I've got are 2/50th of a second at f11. So first of all, there's not going to be any flash. Let's just see how this looks to start off with. Okay, so the pebble dashing on the wall has gone quite dark. That's what I wanted. Now I just switch the flash on. Flash is on 30-second power. Not that it really matters. Okay, so I've got a good exposure, but the wall is quite sharp. What I want to do now is shoot at f4. And to do that, I'll put on an ND filter, a 3-stop ND filter. So I've got the ND filter in place. This is actually a variable ND filter, but I've set it to 3 stops below. So the settings I've got now are 2/50th of a second, same shutter speed, but 3 stops below. So it's now shooting at f4. In theory, I should get exactly the same exposure as the previous one shot at f11. So let's give it a try. Yeah, great. Looks exactly the same, except now we've got a slightly more blurred background. So now I'll take the ND filter off and try it with the high-speed sync triggers. So instead of using 2/50th of a second, I'm going to go to 500th, 1,000th, 2,000ths of a second. Still at f4. So that's 3 stops difference on the shutter speed. Let's give that a try. Remove the ND filter. Okay, set the shutter speed to 500th, 1,000th, 2,000ths of a second. See how this looks. So yeah, that's worked fine. So it does seem that using either an ND filter or high-speed sync is equivalent. Actually, you can't really see it in the video, but looking at the original full-sized images afterwards on my computer, I noticed that the ambient light in the ND filter image is slightly darker. So although there's not much in it, I would say that the ND filter has the edge over high-speed sync. So which is better for getting wider apertures for blurring the background, high-speed sync or ND filters? Well, they've both got their pros and cons. When you use HSS, the ambient light stays the same. You're just reducing the flash power. But when you use ND filters, you lower both the ambient and the light from the flash. So I'd say ND filters are probably more efficient. But having said that, I tend to use high-speed sync more because I have all the necessary equipment and I just find it more convenient. And it gives me less to think about. It just kind of works. Plus, it's a great technology. So for gadget-loving people like me, it's a bit sexier. Bye for now.